You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by New York Times bestselling author Daniel Stashower talking about his book, American Demon, Eliot Ness, and the Hunt for America's Jack the Ripper. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Start by telling us a little bit about your personal and professional background, if you would.
Gosh, my personal and professional background are intertwined. It's hard to separate them. I was thinking about it. I'm very lucky because a lot of the things that interested me personally from childhood forward have become things that have become the basis of the work I do. I was a kid who loved Sherlock Holmes. I loved mystery novels. And that kind of led me into becoming interested in the history of mystery novels. And that led me to Arthur Conan Doyle biographies. And it all kind of went from there. And Conan Doyle himself got interested in various true crime stories over the course of his career. Just seemed like everything unfolded fairly naturally. And I've been lucky enough to be able to follow that thread for many years.
Your subject matter choices for your books are just absolutely fascinating. And so they appeal to the teacher in me, but also the crime lover in me and the history lover in me. So you've written about Arthur Conan Doyle, Philo T. Farnsworth, Edgar Allan Poe, Abraham Lincoln, and now Eliot Ness. Is all of this stemming from childhood loves and interests, or has some of it, how else has the rest of it come around to you?
I would love to be able to tell you that there was a well thought out master plan. There hasn't been. It tended to go where my enthusiasms of the moment take me. In some cases, like you mentioned, Abraham Lincoln, that was intended to be a book about Alan Pinkerton. It was a book about Alan Pinkerton to some extent. When I originally conceived of that book about the Baltimore plot of 1861, the plot to assassinate Lincoln on his way to Washington for his first inauguration as president, I envisioned the story being about how Alan Pinkerton detected and thwarted the plot, with Lincoln just as a piece of cargo that was being carried on the train as it sped towards Washington. And it was only as I dug into that book that it became as much about Lincoln and obviously the State of the Union at that time as it did. But if I try to think of the books I've written as a whole, I realized that all of them have at their core some question that I was unable to answer when I began. And I think that's what draws me to the subjects, which on the surface seem many of them unrelated one to the other.
Is that research driven, Dan? In other words, what are you saying about the questions that you developed that you wanted to get answers to? Is that part of the process where you're learning more about a particular historical character and then you get to the place where you're like, wait a minute, what about this?
Oh, absolutely. I feel that the research, I think a lot of nonfiction writers would say, the research is the part they enjoy. The research, to some extent, never ends. I'm thinking in particular of my Conan Doyle biography, which was my first nonfiction book. As a kid who loved Sherlock Holmes and being of a certain bookish turn of mind, I would start to read the biographies. I read the biographies that were available to me at the time, and they were great. They were terrific books, especially the one by John Dixon Carr. And I enjoyed reading them, and I got a great deal out of them. But there was a point in everything I read about Conan Doyle where they got to his interest in spiritualism. And at that point, they got off. When I was a junior in college, I did a junior year abroad in England. And I bought up everything I could find on that had Conan Doyle's name on it. Of course, there were all kinds of wonderful novels, and I couldn't afford particularly expensive Sherlock Holmes books, but I could afford his spiritualism books. And I was just of a frame of mind to buy pretty much everything that he'd written, which was readily available. So the question began to form in my mind, how did the creator of Sherlock Holmes find his way to spiritualism, the belief that it's possible for we, the living, to communicate with departed souls through a spirit conduit or medium? And I turned to the biographies for answers, and it wasn't that they were avoiding the question, but they did, as I say, back away at that point. And I remember John Dixon Carr in particular, a writer that we all know and admire, described it in terms of a flash that escapes analysis. There was something about Conan Doyle that defied our efforts to understand, which I understand, and that was fair enough. But Conan Doyle was interested in spiritualism for much of his life, and he devoted the last 14 years of his life merely to putting forward this message, so much so that he became known as the St. Paul of spiritualism. So why? And how do you appreciate his whole life without really trying to grapple with where he ended up? I'm not saying I cracked this riddle, but it was what drove me to do the research and to write the book that I did. And that's the part that's interesting to me. In terms of your question about are they research driven, that book was published more than 20 years ago. I'm still researching it. Things come up all the time. That's a well that you never quite get to the bottom of.
So what was the question that was driving you when you started looking into I've seen them called the Cleveland Torso Killings, but I've also heard it called Butcher of Kingsbury Run. What was driving you when you started doing the research into the Butcher of Kingsbury Run?
That story, it's a fairly simple answer. And I've written other books about unsolved crimes. I think people are drawn to that story, to Kingsbury Run and Mad Butcher, the Torso Killer, what have you. People are drawn to that story for the same reason they're drawn to Jack the Ripper. It's a notorious series of crimes, and it's unsolved. And there is this lingering sense of mystery that hangs over it. And that's a temptation for not just for writers, but for anyone who's interested in the nature of crime, true crime in particular.
Seeing as how we are a true crime podcast, why do you think this horrific series of murders went unsolved?
It is sometimes observed that it was just beyond the abilities of the investigators and the Cleveland police at the time. The more I dug into it, the more struck I was by how diligent, how hardworking, and also how creative the investigators in Cleveland were in their approach to this crime. They threw everything they had at this crime. They worked incredibly hard, and they even tried to the best of their ability to push through the limitations of forensic science of the time, to improvise new techniques as they went along. And there are two examples that come to mind. The coroner, at the time when the investigation began, pulled together a panel of experts to discuss the crime and to pool their thoughts and their various perspectives on the case to produce what they called a synthetic portrait of the killer. Today, we would understand that as criminal profiling.
Right.
They just instinctively were groping towards it in their efforts to get a handle on this crime. And there was another instance that really struck me where there was a particular suspect that they were looking for, but they couldn't find a picture of him. But they only had a picture of him as a child. So what they did was they took this picture, they projected it onto a piece of canvas, and an artist, using descriptions, embellished it.
Aged it
up to approximate what the suspect might look like today. Today, we've seen that on any number of shows and movies, age progression soft. But I find it remarkable that the investigators in Cleveland at that time, who really, there was nothing in their rule book that would have prepared them for this. They really were doing their best to push through and find the handle on this case. As with any unsolved crime, and you guys know this as well as anyone, there are frustrations, there are conflicts, there are all kinds of things that bubble up and then fall through the cracks. Again, in this case, it sure wasn't from lack of effort. They did their absolute damnedest.
So within the limits of 1930s investigative technology, they did everything they could. You're actually describing things that are commonplace now, weren't commonplace 10 or 20 years ago, never mind 90 years ago.
If it could have been solved just through sheer effort, through the number of man hours spent on it, yeah, they'd have gotten there.
So ultimately, if it wasn't lack of effort on the part of the Cleveland Police Department, and it certainly sounds like it wasn't that, what else was it that kept this from making it across the finish line, do you think?
It's very difficult to say because there are so many contradictions and so many different angles on this story. But a lot of the coverage at the time made note of the fact that these crimes unfolded on a timeline that coincided with the 50th anniversary of Jack the Ripper's crime. There were a lot of similarities, but there were also differences. And those differences also fold into why it posed such a challenge to the Cleveland investigators. We know what type of victim Jack the Ripper was preying on.
Yeah. In
Cleveland, there didn't seem to be a pattern. Men and women, black and white, they all over the spectrum of people. What they seemed to have in common was that they were transient, indigent, people on the margins of society. In a phrase that was used again and again at the time, people who would not be missed, which suggests an opportunistic killer, which made it all the more troubling for the investigators.
So, I asked you this already off air because I couldn't stand to wait until Wednesday to get this answer from you. And I asked you which interest of yours came first. Was it the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run case that was interesting to you, or was it Eliot Ness? Because I can see how both would be very interesting. So which of them came first?
For me personally,
yes,
it was the Butcher story. I heard it for the first time around a campfire when I was 8 or 9 years old. I was at summer camp. So imagine it. I'm there, we're roasting s'mores, and one of the counselors starts telling us essentially a campfire ghost story based on the Butcher. I remember at one point we had to stop to get an explanation of what the word decapitated meant.
Oh my God.
And I remember that there were many repetitions of the phrase, and the killer is still out there.
Wow.
I swear this is inappropriate for little kids on a camping trip.
Yeah, no. If even one kid went home and said there would be a lot of irate parents on the phone.
Yeah, no kidding.
But you didn't have to embellish this story a whole lot to turn it into the stuff of nightmares. And I don't think anybody slept that night. Yeah. So for me, that came first. It was the story of the Butcher, and was for me and for a lot of people, I would imagine, it was a childhood boogeyman, especially for people growing up as I did in the Cleveland area.
Kristin asked that question, and I didn't know she obviously had talked to you about this a little bit beforehand. When you started, I thought to myself, he's going to say Eliot Ness. It was exactly the opposite.
It's funny because I grew up very aware of Ness. Eliot Ness, he's the hero of Chicago. Leafield, deep dish pizza, Eliot Ness. We know him. We remember him as a Chicago guy, leader of the Untouchables. When we think of Eliot Ness, we think of a truck bursting through the doors of one of Al Capone's breweries. We don't think of Cleveland. But that chapter of his life was pretty much wrapped up with the repeal of Prohibition, and it was more or less over by the time he turned 30. So Ness was a very young man when he was the leader of the Untouchables. He was a very young man in Chicago. He needed a second act, and he found one in Cleveland as director of public safety. When I was growing up, you heard about Ness, you heard about him being in Cleveland, but it was always, or at least to me, age 12, 13, whatever I was, it was always a little contradictory. We were told when I was growing up in Cleveland Heights, his widow had lived nearby. I know his son went to my junior high school. There were things like that. But at that time, I hadn't really grasped until I started looking at newspaper headlines and things like that, just how important a figure he had been in Cleveland as director of public safety. It was a big job, a big promotion. The chief of police reported to Eliot Ness, who got the job when he was 32 years old. And the fire chief also, and the building department. He's in Chicago. He'd been in charge of a handful of guys. And now he's running a department that's in charge of thousands of city employees. I mean, it was huge. And a lot of people expected him to fall flat on his face. His marching orders were to clean up the police department, which was essentially rotting from the inside out because of corruption, and also to try to address the stranglehold that the mob had on the city. No big. Clean up the police department, take down the mob.
And take down the mob.
And then break for lunch.
With a crooked police department that was rife with corruption.
Incredible. But the miracle of it is the success that he had, the degree to which he succeeded in cleaning up the town. It's really a remarkable story, but when we think of Ness, of course, we think of Chicago because of the TV book, the TV, and the movie.
The moment that I picked up your book and started to read it, you hit me with a bombshell. Page 1 is when you were talking about the fact that Eliot Ness kept tabs on your grandfather. And I was like, this is a whole new ballgame. This is crazy. Tell us a little bit about the fact that your granddad knew Eliot Ness. That's crazy.
I did not know that going in.
Really?
And I can't tell you what a surprise it was.
I bet it was.
His papers are held in Cleveland at the Western Reserve Historical Society Library, the History Center in Cleveland. It's a wonderful facility. There are some big bulging scrapbooks of Ness's personal material there. And a lot of it is what you'd expect. It's newspaper clippings about Ness and about articles of interest. And there are a lot of familiar names, people whose names we know and remember today. There are gangsters. There's Capone and others. And there are other of the era's bright FDR and John D. Rockefeller and J. Edgar Hoover. I'm turning the pages and J. Edgar Hoover, Fred P. Stashower. I'm turning the page and wait, what? Fred P. Stashower? I thought, surely I have fallen asleep at the library, which is not unknown. It has happened. But I look again, and sure enough, there he is, my grandfather, a man I knew well. I'd love to be able to come on here and tell you that my grandfather was a bootlegger, or he was a bank robber, or best of all, a murder suspect. No such luck. It turns out that he and Ness crossed paths at least once a year at something called the Anvil Review. Grandfather was a member of Cleveland City Club, where these otherwise sober-minded businessmen got together and they put on a program of sketches and comedy bits and songs meant to poke fun at the city's leaders and fat cats, which included Eliot Ness. So at least once a year, and perhaps more, they'd have been in the same room, and my grandfather would have been on stage participating in these sketches. It was like the Washington Correspondents' Dinner or a Comedy Central roast or something like that. And Ness apparently was tickled by it, because he cut out articles about it. And there's one set of caricatures of the actors on stage, including my grandfather, pasted into the scrapbook. And there's also a picture of Ness with his hand pressed to his forehead, laughing in appreciation of a joke at his own expense. It's the craziest thing, because I knew my grandfather very well for 34 years. And I don't recall him ever mentioning Eliot Ness by name.
Wow.
I'm picturing these guys in drag doing these.
You're not wrong, Bill. There was some of that. And there was somebody who took the stage to parody Ness wearing short pants and a Peter Pan collar and a little beanie, like a scouting uniform, and that was meant to be parodying Ness's enthusiasm, Ness's youth and his gee whiz enthusiasm. And he would say, come in spouting these sort of naive sentiments. And in one year, they had him with a pair of angel wings clipped to his back, and he gives his line, and he says, "Wait, the sound of a siren, I fly!" And he turns and sort of flutters away. I wish there were recordings.
I know. If only there were video.
But alas, no.
And Ness, for a guy who believed in myth making on a lot of levels, it sounds like he didn't mind being poked fun at.
No, he may have been untouchable, but he could take a joke. And it's one of many things about him that I find completely admirable. He just seems to have enjoyed it and didn't take himself, at least in that instance, certainly wasn't taking himself too seriously.
Given the fact, like Bill just alluded to, Eliot Ness has this whole larger-than-life persona, especially when he was at the height of his fame. And then again, when the Untouchables came out, Again, we've got this version of Eliot Ness that's writ large in the public consciousness. Was it difficult to determine what was fact and what was fiction or expedient exaggeration when it came to Eliot Ness and his exploits?
Yeah, it is. And it starts with the book, The Untouchables, which was written when Ness believed himself to be a forgotten figure, and with a collaborator, a sports writer named Oscar Fraley. There's some correspondence, but by no means all, between Fraley and Ness in Cleveland that you can look at, and they also spent some time together. The story goes that they met while Ness was in New York on a business trip with a partner, and his partner knew Fraley, and they had met up in a bar, and it was pretty clear that no business was going to get done because Fraley was in no position to invest in this business that Ness and his partner had going on. So these two friends were just catching up while Ness sat quietly at the bar drinking. And at one point, Ness's friend turns to Fraley and says, "You ought to get Eliot to tell you his story. He's got some amazing stories about his time in Chicago. He's the guy who took down Al Capone." In Fraley's telling the story, he didn't believe it. Ness looks like this mild-mannered guy, and Ness got to talking. The stories just flowed out, and the next thing they knew, it was morning. And
wow.
Ness snapped out of it, seemed a little abashed, and said, "Oh, let's cut this out. Let's go get some breakfast." And Fraley said, "You should write a book." One thing led to another, and they collaborated on it together. There's a document that Ness pulled called The Incident. That's a fairly straightforward recounting of some of the incidents that took place in Chicago. There's also stuff from Fraley saying, "Listen, don't get worried if we embroider the facts a little, if we embellish. We have poetic license." It seems to have troubled Ness. And so that's where some of the myth-making and some of the exaggerations and all that began. And then the TV series obviously took that, punched it through to the next level.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Something you said a moment ago, Dan, brought me up short. Why would Eliot Ness, looking at this from a 2022 perspective, why would he regard himself as a forgotten figure, even back then? Was this myth all after the book and then the television series and the movies? And is that more of a recent creation, this myth of Eliot Ness?
Ness was extremely famous at the height of the Untouchables drama. There was all kinds of newspaper coverage that focused on Ness and the Untouchables. And he was very careful at the time and afterwards to be clear in saying, look, and I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't I do quote it directly in the book, but he said, "We did our part, of course, but the real work of putting Capone behind bars was done by the taxmen. Ness wasn't a taxman." He said, "We did our part. Our job was more spectacular. That was all." But he was careful to give credit to the Treasury agents who had done the careful work of building this tax case against Capone. And of course, it was the tax case that is what put him away. Ness did an important job of cutting off Capone's sources of revenue and payoffs, and while this was going on, and also there had been a plan in place to also bring forward evidence on violations, not just tax issues. That case was never carried forward. But if you're a newspaper man covering that story at the time, you're either going to write about a strict interpretation of tax law or this handsome young prohibition agent who drove a truck through the doors of an Al Capone brewery. Which story are you going to focus on? Which movie would you rather see?
The tax stuff is a little dry.
So Ness got a lot of attention.
Right.
And that carried over into his years in Cleveland. He still was getting a lot of attention. But the Untouchables that chapter of his career began to fade a little bit into the rearview mirror. Then his time as director of public safety came to an end. He did some work in Washington during World War II. And when he came back, he decided he was going to become a businessman. And he said, "I may fall flat on my face, but I'm sure having fun." In fact, he did fall flat on his face. He didn't do terribly well as a businessman, and not for lack of trying. But during those years, as one of his friends said, his career became a checkerboard that defies analysis. And he tried very hard to translate his work as director of public safety and as leader of the Untouchables into a business career. He had a pretty good innings, but he hitched himself to some horses that did not pan out. Then he decided he would make a run at becoming mayor of Cleveland, and that didn't pan out. And I'm sorry to go on at such length about it, but to answer your original question, although Ness participated in the writing of the book, The Untouchables, he didn't live to see it published. And he did not live to see the television series that began 2 years after the publication. And he did not live to see the thunderclap of celebrity that attended particularly the television show.
How old was Ness when he died?
He was in his 50s, and he died of a heart attack pretty young. So none of that. And so he didn't see Robert Stack portraying him in the television series. He certainly didn't see Kevin Costner portraying him in 1987. No, he was long gone. Maybe if he had been around, he'd have cashed in. Maybe he would have had a moderating effect on some of the mythologizing, on some of the myth making that went on, particularly in the TV show. But there's a point at which he's no longer around to have any role at all in the legend of Eliot Ness.
In the myth making. Kristin and I were talking about this in a recent podcast. We were reading Edgar Allan Poe, and of course Poe is from an era pre-recording devices for the most part, and there even aren't very many photographs of the man. Kristin was saying we didn't know what his voice sounded like. And actually, when we talk about Eliot Ness today, in my head, I'm actually picturing Robert Stack.
Oh, of course.
Because he played the part so well.
But that speaks to your point about the myth making. Who do you see when I say Sherlock Holmes? You see your first one. Yeah, Basil Rathbone. Maybe you see Jeremy Brett.
With the crazy hat.
Yeah. Eliot Ness was a real guy. But people tend to think of him as being Robert Stack, of that clipped delivery, maybe with a Tommy gun in his hand.
Oh, exactly. I actually was doing that when you first mentioned his name with the Tommy gun.
Absolutely. And believe me, the real Eliot Ness, I yield to no one in my admiration for the 1987 movie. But believe me when I tell you, the real Eliot Ness did not throw Frank Nitti off the roof of the Chicago courthouse building. Just didn't happen that way. But it makes a great story.
You've taken on two really tremendous subjects here they must have a ton of research material that you had to sift through. Can you give us a little insight into your research process? Because I imagine there was a ton of it to do.
Oh, sure. And believe me when I talk about the story versus the real man, I'm not in any way diminishing Ness's career or what he accomplished. He was astonishingly brave, and he accomplished incredible things. He just didn't do some of the things that he's portrayed as doing, particularly in the Robert Stack TV series, where obviously there had to be a problem of the week to be sorted out. But the research was tremendous fun because a lot of it is in the newspapers of the time. And you can see Ness in particular in the early days in Chicago, not quite finding his feet yet in dealing with reporters, being a little awkward and not quite sure. There's one interview that I particularly like where he's speaking to a young woman, an attractive young woman who this should have brought out the best in him because she was a young woman who had a particular interest in crime detection. She'd actually taken courses and gotten a terrific education in criminology. And she managed to draw out a great deal from Ness about his views on criminology. But there was also this note of artifice that kept creeping into it, where you could see that he was trying on a persona of a devil-may-care young man who just happened into his career. And he was using phrases like, it afforded a great deal of amusement too, things like that. And another reporter who recalled Ness speaking to him, but then dropping his mask and giving a wink as if it was all a joke between the two of them. He said something like, he is, in short, an enigma. And again, I'm paraphrasing here, but an enigma with lots of potential. And seeing that develop over time in the newspaper coverage was fascinating because Ness was very canny, or became incredibly canny, about using the press as Sherlock Holmes. He was a boyhood enthusiast. He loved the Sherlock Holmes story. The Sherlock Holmes stories, as Holmes once said, the press is a valuable institution if only you know how to use it. Ness learned how to, particularly in Cleveland when he was new in town, he knew that the press was going to be able to show him around at a time when he was literally learning his way around as well as figuratively, and that they knew where the bodies were buried. So he forged very close relationships with reporters, and that proved useful to him in every phase of his career.
You mentioned going down rabbit holes, which is one of our favorite expressions on Mind Over Murder. We talk about it a lot in the Colonial Parkway murders and other cases. You mentioned going down rabbit holes regarding the Torso murders, the subject of American Demon. What were some of the rabbit holes you found yourself going down?
I think you've probably seen this more than once. I think every writer who approaches an unsolved crime comes at it with the hope that they'll spot something or stumble across something that has lain hidden or undisturbed all these years. We live in hope. And I think approaching a crime that way, even if you don't seriously believe that, say, you're going to rip the Jack the Ripper case wide open after all these years, I do think it's a useful hat to wear in terms of coming to grips with the material and developing an understanding of the case. There's no better way to get your arms around the details of a case than to actually imagine yourself investigating it. The more time that passes, of course, the trail grows colder and colder on this and any case. But of course, you live in hope of something bubbling up, or in some way, modern criminology, modern crime techniques being able to shed some light on it. There were a couple of victims of the Torso killer about whom we do know something. I worked pretty hard running some of those details through computer databases and doing work down at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives. Didn't particularly go anywhere, but I feel that I developed a better understanding. It helped me look through some of the murkier areas of the crime and at least try to understand at least some of the challenges that would have faced the investigators at the time.
And writing about true crime can be very challenging, especially when those crimes are as gruesome as they are. How did you step outside of your subject matter at the end of the day so that you could continue to interact and not constantly have brutalized bodies in your head? This is something that I know we both share as people who report on crimes. This is hard. It's tough to do. How did you manage to separate yourself from it? Or did you?
I wasn't entirely successful. I have to say this story got under my skin in a way that surprised me. I've written about true crime before, but The Beautiful Cigar Girl, which was a terrible murder, it was one crime rather than a series of them. There were a lot of things about this case that just converged to make it very hard to shake off at the end of the day. And I'll ask for your indulgence here because it's difficult to talk about this I'm always suspicious of writers who talk about how very sensitive they are and they're magical unicorns and they experience things so much more deeply than other people. Anybody would be mortified and by the horror of these crimes and that there were so many of them. But I came to this story because I'd always wanted to do a story set in my hometown of Cleveland. And my father was ill, and I knew I would be spending a lot of time in Cleveland. And it seemed like the timing was good if I to do a story in Cleveland because I was going to be going back and forth. And my father remembered some of the details. My father was very small when this was unfolding, but there were elements of this case. For instance, there's Ness, at the time Cleveland was putting on this Great Lakes exposition, great big World's Fair that was patterned on the Chicago exposition. My father remembered going to it.
Oh, wow.
There were things about Ness, there were parades and things that happened during this time period that my father remembered. And it started to become personal through that. My father and I talked about it a lot. It gave us something to talk about during those years. And that made it hard to leave behind at the end of the day. So it was something that, again, this sounds so self-serving and in a way that I don't intend it to be. I found myself, when the book came out, just needing to try to shake it off.
Yeah.
In some ways. And a friend suggested something that if I were a bit younger, I would have poo-pooed it. I'd have sort of said, oh, that sounds ridiculous. There's a memorial tribute. Ness's grave marker memorial is in the same cemetery where my parents are buried and my grandparents. So I visited often. And I'm in the habit, when I visit my father's gravestone, of leaving a little airplane-sized bottle of Jameson's Irish whiskey there.
Oh, very appropriate.
Oh.
Yeah.
The last time I was there, I also went to Ness's memorial and left a copy of the book.
Oh, wow,
And it
Dan.
just felt like a way of, believe me, I don't intend that as, look, Eliot, I did this for you.
Yeah.
Because it's not that. The story continues. The
Sure.
story began long before I got there, and it'll continue. Lots of people are involved with it. There's been all kinds of wonderful work done on this case, and will continue to be in the future. But it was trying to at least signal that I had tried to do my best.
That's fantastic.
I
love that.
I do too. When you were talking about your research, Dan, I was thinking about you going back and digging into these newspaper archives for all of the articles from Cleveland, Chicago, and elsewhere. Does microfiche still play a part in your life, or have we digitized all of those newspapers?
God, microfiche plays a huge part. Though that same hand crank, or with a little button that makes it go. And I swear, it takes you right back to junior high school.
Yes,
because that hasn't changed a whole lot. The reel to reel of microfilm, but yeah, the microfiche where you put it on that hot glass plate, you can almost smell it cooking under there.
And and you turn the crank on some of the models of.
Yeah.
What's
but
interesting,
I like that.
Both of us do too, but one of the things that Kristin and I have talked about is, in addition to finding the articles, which can take some time, you also see all sorts of other articles and even the advertisements in a lot of these newspapers. So you're actually looking at an old newspaper page by page, which is fascinating.
Fascinating, but also useful, because it does give you some very important context about the way the story was weighted compared to other things that were going on at the time. When one of the bodies in Cleveland was discovered, the headline that day was "Help Sinking Amelia Radios." It was Amelia Earhart had disappeared while this was going on.
At the same time.
Wow.
And things like that. You just see all kinds of remarkable things happening at the same time, competing for bandwidth with the developments of these stories. You see what people were concerned with, and I think that's very useful. But I also have to say, it was also very interesting looking at the scrapbooks, looking at the articles that Ness preserved. Very early on, there was an article about himself at some kind of civic dinner where he's dressed up in evening clothes, and he's with his wife, and a lot of the city's leaders are there. It's a grand night out with the city's wheelers and dealers, and he's clipped this article out very carefully and put it in his scrapbook. When I came across the same article in the newspaper, one of the things that he had clipped around was the discovery of some body parts in one of these killings. And it was very interesting to see how, at least in the early days, as director of public safety, that wasn't something nobody expected the director of public safety, at least at the beginning, to become involved in this. He wasn't brought on to investigate murders any more than he was brought in to put out house fires or rescue cats stranded in trees, although the fire chief also reported to him. Mm-hmm. But this is Eliot Ness we're talking about. And over time, as the coverage continues, he did get drawn into it. People did expect action, and he himself had said, "Look, I'm going to lead from the front lines. I'm not going to be a remote director and stuck in my office at City Hall. I'm going to be out there. I'm going to be out there doing the job." And he did.
You describe yourself a couple times in the book as being a true crime aficionado, and I know that you are. What are some other cases that you feel like you'd like to sink your teeth into? Although I imagine you'd need a break from it for a little bit after dealing with the torso killings.
I think a lot of true crime, you must see this all the time, but I think a lot of true crime enthusiasts and a lot of true crime writers would say the same thing. One of the things, the most important thing, perhaps, that draws me into a particular story is character. So when I was a Beautiful Scar Girl, I was drawn in by the character of Edgar Allan Poe. It's a very interesting story. And with Hour of Peril, I was originally drawn in by my interest in the character of Alan Pinkerton, another remarkable story. This barefoot Cooper in Dundee, Illinois, who suddenly not suddenly, but by slow degrees, finds himself America's first private eye. Just a fantastic. And Eliot Ness is a similar character that's just fascinating. Even if you were to strip the torso murders out of it, Eliot Ness would still be this spectacularly interesting character. For me, that's what draws me in, these really interesting figures who you can build the story around. I mentioned at the beginning when we started talking about childhood enthusiasms. Another childhood enthusiasm of mine was magic and magicians. I was crazy about it. I've been a member of the Society of American Magicians for more than 40 years, although I am a terrible magician because I don't practice. But I've always dreamed of finding a story that somehow involved magicians, magic to some extent, but also true crime. There's never been anything that where they quite intersected to the degree that I would need to be able to spin something out of it. But
challenge accepted. I'm going to look for something now.
That would be the dream.
I'm going to look for something now. I'll look for it.
Unless you moved back to the fictional side of
That's the thing. Yeah. I used to love reading books by people like Clayton Rawson and Walter B. Gibson and John Dixon Carr, where there'd be an elegant top-hatted magician with an opera cape who just happens to be great at solving crime.
That's a different approach, though. You're not
a very different approach.
Basing it on a true crime story.
I've talked your ears off.
No, this is fascinating.
Dan, the book is American Demon, Eliot Ness and the Hunt for America's Jack the Ripper, and we can find it.
Fine books are sold, or my website, stashower.com, but really most anywhere.
Dan, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today about American Demon. It's an amazing book, and all of your books are amazing. We do encourage our listeners to buy all of Dan's other books as well. They are fantastic.
Kind of you to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.